Okay, so this is the first lecture in this class, and as you can see, it's entitled The Political Failure of Reconstruction, and I'm going to be talking about the phases of Reconstruction, Reconstruction being the attempt by the U.S. government to put the nation back together after the Civil War, to have those seceded states rejoin the Union. You'll notice here on the first slide I have a picture of South Carolina's first post-war legislature, and as you can see, it has a majority of black legislators. And you might think this is odd for a state that was one of the most strongly dedicated to the institution of slavery. South Carolina was the first state to secede from the Union in 1860. And so how it came to have a post-war legislature with a black majority is an interesting mystery that we're going to be addressing today. Reconstruction has three phases, three chronological phases: presidential Reconstruction, radical Reconstruction, and Redeemer or Southern Reconstruction, and I'm going to be addressing each of those in turn. Now, presidential Reconstruction, as you could probably gather, is called this because the presidents at the time took the initiative in coming up with Reconstruction plans. So first Abraham Lincoln, and then after his assassination in April of 1865, the reins were taken over by Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president. Now, when Lincoln was in charge of presidential Reconstruction, that was all well and good because he had established his bona fides as somebody who was, at least by the end of the war, dedicated to the elimination of slavery and to something like civil equality. But Andrew Johnson was an unreconstructed white supremacist. He was from Tennessee. And so he was not really a guy who was dedicated to the notion of equal rights for African Americans. The theory of presidential Reconstruction was that the country should be reunited quickly with a minimum of fuss and no idea of punishing the South, but rather just reuniting the country with the 11 states that had seceded from the Union. The method of presidential Reconstruction, Lincoln first came up with a wartime Reconstruction plan, which would have allowed states to rejoin the Union when 10% of their voters agreed to swear an oath of loyalty to the Constitution. Now, that's not that many in the scheme of things, and Lincoln's 10% plan was very unpopular with the Republicans in Congress at that time. Just a side note, because it was during the Civil War, the period that I'm talking about, most of the Democrats had left Congress. They belonged mainly to the seceded states, and so it's pretty much a Republican majority all through this period. The Republicans proposed something called the Wade-Davis bill, and they said it has to be 50% of each state's voters who are loyal before a state can rejoin the Union. Well, unfortunately, before any of this could get incorporated into a Reconstruction Act, Lincoln was assassinated, and as I said a moment ago, his vice president, who was a white supremacist, took over. And Andrew Johnson thus presided over Congress's passage of the Reconstruction Act of May 29, 1865. The Reconstruction Act granted amnesty to anybody in the South who would take an oath of loyalty. And if you were somebody like a high official in the Confederate government or in the Army who could not take a loyalty oath because you weren't eligible, you could petition for forgiveness. So the point was to forgive people who had fought against their country as quickly as possible and to restore all their property except for the former human property that they owned, their slaves. The southern states had a provisional governor who was appointed for each one. And then a constitutional convention was called to rewrite each state's constitution to exclude slavery. But the states didn't have to ratify the 13th Amendment, which is the anti-slavery amendment. So it was an easy process to incorporate all the states back into the Union. The result of the 1865 Reconstruction Act was that only white people could vote. Former Confederates, former people who had been part of the Confederate States of America, were elected to high office. A series of laws were passed in the states called the Black Codes, which meant that African Americans were discriminated against legally in various ways. For example, they were forced into apprenticeships. There were limitations put on hunting and fishing. They were not allowed to go around the countryside and try to reunite their family members. That was called vagrancy. If you were caught roaming around the countryside without visible means of support, you would be thrown into jail.
Get the phone, hurry, get.
So all of these laws were passed under the May 29th, 1865 Reconstruction Act regime. And then one of the things that the Republicans in Congress objected to the most was the veto of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was this organization that was set up right after the Civil War in order to help people who had been displaced by the conflict, providing them with food and shelter. It started up some schools for African Americans in the South. So it was a very important institution, and Congress went to renew its funding, and that funding renewal was vetoed by Andrew Johnson. And this was something that made the Republicans in Congress furious. And for this and other reasons, they decided to impeach him. Now, when you impeach somebody, it means that you bring charges of high crimes and misdemeanors against the president. Impeachment is a political process. And it is not the same as removal from office. That's the second step, and something that is done by the Senate. So while Johnson was impeached, that is, he was accused of obstruction of justice and overstepping the bounds of his office, he was not actually removed from office. You can see here, as on the previous slide, there is a cartoon that has to do with the period of presidential Reconstruction. This is obviously an anti-Freedmen's Bureau cartoon. It presents the African American here in a very stereotypical way. So take a moment to look at the argument there being made against the Freedmen's Bureau, mainly an economic argument. Okay. Well, after Johnson kind of lost the initiative in Congress, there was a midterm election in 1866, and 2/3 of those elected to Congress were radical Republicans. They were led by Thaddeus Stevens, a very eloquent radical Republican, and this initiates a time period that we call Radical Reconstruction that lasts from 1866 to 1876. The theory of Radical Reconstruction was to punish the Southern whites and demand civil rights for African Americans. And how they were going to punish the Southern whites was by pulling those 11 states back out of the Union, putting them into 5 military districts, and then putting on much more stringent requirements for them to re-enter the Union. One of the features of the Radical Reconstruction period was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And the Civil Rights Act of 1866 secured for African Americans equal access to the civil courts and equal treatment in criminal codes. So this meant that those black codes of the 1865 period were now unlawful. And by the Civil Rights Act, African Americans had equal access to public facilities. The Civil Rights Act also excluded former rebels, that is, white people who had taken up arms against the Union, from public office. Again, Andrew Johnson vetoed this piece of legislation, but it was passed over his veto. So you can see here the continued estrangement of Congress from the president. The Reconstruction Act of 1867, as I said a moment ago, dissolved the state governments in the former Confederacy, removed them from the Union, put them into 5 military districts under martial law, and said, in order to come back into the Union, you need to have a constitutional convention, and for this constitutional convention, you need to let everyone vote. Every man, black and white, has to be allowed to vote for a representative to the Constitutional Convention. Then the Constitution has to guarantee African Americans the vote, and the new states have to ratify the 14th Amendment, which I will talk about momentarily. The picture here is showing the passage of the 15th Amendment, which again I'll talk about momentarily, but it is the amendment that allows African American men the right to vote. So a lot of proud representations of people voting here. All right, the Civil War amendments passed under Radical Reconstruction included the 14th Amendment in 1868, which secured citizenship for people born in the U.S., that's called birthright citizenship, and equal protection under the laws of all people living in the U.S. So the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment refers to people, not just citizens. Why was it necessary for the Supreme Court, or not the Supreme Court, sorry, why was it necessary for Congress to say that people born in the U.S. are citizens of the U.S.? Well, this is before the time period of the class, but in 1857, the Supreme Court had stated that African Americans were not citizens of the United States or of any state. And so Congress was saying here the Supreme Court was wrong in 1857, and in fact, anybody born in the U.S. is a citizen. The 15th Amendment, passed in 1870, gave African Americans the right to vote. When I say African Americans here, I just mean men. It was kind of seen as a reward for the fact that such a large number of African Americans had fought on the side of the Union in the Civil War. As soon as black men could join the fight in 1863, 1864, many of them did. There was a very active women's rights movement in the U.S., and I gotta say, white women were very annoyed that they were excluded from the vote, whereas African American men were included. Women did not get the right to vote in the U.S. until much later in American history. When it came to economic rights, this was certainly the downside of Radical Reconstruction. Many of the Republican radicals in Congress were employers of labor, and they didn't necessarily want to go against the property rights of people with property by saying, oh, we're going to take property away from white Americans and give it to African Americans. We're going to give them land, or we're going to give them a stake, some kind of monetary amount, an annuity or anything like that. We're not going to pay them back, in other words, for all of the unpaid labor that they have done for decades. And as we will see momentarily, this is one of the things that really leads to the failure of Reconstruction, that when enslaved people were freed, they had no capital. in order to start businesses. They had no land in order to farm, and this was a major issue. Now, just because the radicals in the Congress had the political initiative didn't mean that they had suddenly defeated white supremacy. And in the South, starting in the late 1860s, former rebels who had fought for the Confederacy created an institution called the Ku Klux Klan. This was mainly ex-Confederate officers who formed into this terrorist cell where they dressed in disguises. You can see an early KKK disguise here in this cartoon. And they went around the countryside in the South, terrorizing African Americans in their homes, torturing people, and killing Republicans, whether they were white Republicans or black Republicans. The Ku Klux Klan Act that was passed by Congress made civil rights offenses of this nature federal crimes, rather than having these kinds of terrorist activities be tried at the state level. Why is that important? Well, in the Ku Klux Klan in the South in the 1860s, you had police officers, you had judges, you had white legislators. And so only by making these kinds of terrorist activities federal crimes could the Klan be clamped down upon. And in fact, it was somewhat effective in helping to at least make the Klan go underground for a few decades. We'll see them pop up again in full force in the 19-teens and 1920s. Many former Confederates were ineligible to vote in elections for delegates to state constitutional conventions, and up to 30% of whites refused to participate in elections in which black men could vote. So in some states during Radical Reconstruction, black voters were in the majority, like South Carolina and Louisiana. So this explains how it is that South Carolina's first post-war legislature has a black majority. The constitutions that were drafted by these constitutional conventions marked the first time that southern states had universal male suffrage. That's everybody who's a man has the right to vote. They provided for public schools, progressive taxation, better court systems, better judicial systems, social welfare institutions like hospitals, orphan asylums, hospitals for mentally ill people. So these were some of the most progressive constitutions that the nation had ever seen. And the people who served in the constitutional conventions and then subsequently in the state legislatures were mainly three groups. They were Southern whites who had supported the Union, and they were referred to by their white supremacist neighbors as scalawags. Then there were state legislators who were what were called carpetbaggers. That's people who came from the North to take up positions in the South in state legislatures. They were called carpetbaggers because a carpetbag was a kind of little suitcase that they would bring with them. But African American delegates also served in large numbers in these new state legislatures. Approximately 2,000 African Americans served as office holders at various levels of government in the South during Black Reconstruction. Many of them had been slaves, and they were very ethical and very serious about their jobs. A few Black Republicans even held high positions. Black men served as lieutenant governor in Louisiana, Mississippi, and South Carolina. Some Black men became superintendent of education. More than a total of 13 Black politicians served in the House of Representatives, the U.S. House of Representatives. They included Robert Smalls of South Carolina, who was notable for his heroism during the Civil War. And there were two black senators from Mississippi, Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. It's interesting to note that the period of radical Reconstruction had more African Americans in legislatures than any other time in U.S. history until the 1970s and after. So this was really the high point of black representation, politically speaking. Here are some of the senator and representatives from the 41st and 42nd Congress of the United States. You can see people have that very fashionable late 19th century mutton chop whisker thing going on. All right, well, unfortunately, the period of radical Reconstruction did not last long. In 1873, there was a major financial panic that impacted the North, and lots of Northerners suddenly were less enthusiastic about investing their money in Southern states. And then in 1876, there was a presidential election that gave people the pretext that they needed to pull out of the South altogether. The 1876 presidential election featured two candidates, a Democrat by the name of Samuel Tilden of New York State and a Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes. It was clear that Tilden, the Democrat, won the popular vote, but the electoral vote in 1877 was contested. There were several states where there were allegations of electoral fraud. One of those states was Florida. And so as late as January of 1877, it was unclear who the president was going to be. In 1877, in contrast with in the year 2000 when this happened again, instead of having the question go to the Supreme Court or anything, they sat down in a smoke-filled room, the top Democrats and the top Republicans, and they brokered a compromise which has come to be called the Compromise of 1877. And by this compromise, the Northerners agreed to pull their troops out of the South and to allow Southerners to be in charge of Reconstruction, to allow them to handle things at the state level. And in return for that, the Republican, who had not won the majority of the popular vote, would be nominated or would be sort of coronated president. And so Rutherford B. Hayes became president. He served a single, very undistinguished presidential term. People called him your fraudulency. But this gave an opportunity for African Americans to now be oppressed by Southern Reconstruction. I'm going to talk more about what happened in the South after 1877 in subsequent lectures, but suffice it to say that, again, you have the reentry into politics of the same white people who had been in politics before the Civil War. There was all kinds of discriminatory legislation that comes to be called the Jim Crow laws that I'll be talking about. There were high taxes put on poor people. So Southern Reconstruction really lasts from 1877 up until the 1960s. What did historians say about Reconstruction? This is a pretty important point. The period of radical Reconstruction, the period when African Americans served in large numbers in state legislatures and to some extent in the federal government, was written about mainly by Southerners, white Southerners in the late 19th and early 20th century. For reasons that I'm not going to go into here, a lot of historians were from the South, and they judged Reconstruction a failure because they said, well, Reconstruction was a horrible oppression of Southern whites. It set the South back economically and politically by putting Northern whites and incompetent black politicians in charge. there was a very famous historian by the name of Ulrich B. Phillips, U.B. Phillips, who thought that Reconstruction and actually the freeing of the slaves was one of the most terrible things that had ever been done in American history. Now, at the same time that this interpretation was active, W.E.B. Du Bois, who I'll be talking more about later on in the course, a very prominent black intellectual who had earned the PhD, wrote a book about African Americans and American history, and he said, actually, this history as written by white people has political motives. And the failure story is not a true failure, but rather it's due to the triumph of white supremacy in North and South. That in fact, African Americans, when they had a chance to be in politics, were ethical, they were progressive, they were trying to modernize their states. Now, it's interesting to note that the interpretation that prevails today gives much more credence to W.E.B. Du Bois than it does to the, Ulrich Phillips school. Eric Foner at Columbia University is one of the most famous historians of this time period, and he said, Reconstruction governments were, in fact, somewhat successful politically, but the end of Northern Reconstruction, the beginning of Southern Reconstruction and Redeemer Reconstruction causes those governments' achievements to be completely wiped out. Foner also says, and this is very important, that the big failure in Reconstruction was the failure to redistribute land, to give land to African Americans who had put in all this unpaid labor for decades without any kind of recompense. Another big failure, the failure to provide them with any kind of federally subsidized training or an economic stake. So the failure of the government to consider redistribution, economic redistribution, a priority is what really leads to the failure of Reconstruction. We can discuss more of this in the week's discussion area. I look forward to any questions or comments that you may have and to having any kind of future conversations about this with you guys. But that is it for now. Over and out.